David Montgomery, the CEO of Montgomery Deli, stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his apron. He had never worked in a deli before, but today he was determined to experience what his employees went through daily. Disguised as a regular employee, he adopted the name Dan, and hoped his disguise would be convincing enough. With a final glance at his reflection, David stepped out, feeling both excited and apprehensive. As he walked through the doors of his deli, David felt the hustle of the kitchen, the sizzling grills, and the chatter of the workers. The aroma of fresh sandwiches and sizzling meats filled the air. His employees greeted him with little more than a passing glance, not recognizing him in the least. For the first time in years, David felt like just another person. He began his shift by making sandwiches and helping with the day's orders, though his mind wandered. He was here for one purpose: to understand the lives of his employees and how the deli truly ran. David was no stranger to working long hours, but being behind the counter at his own deli gave him a new perspective. It wasn't just the physical labor. The constant juggling of orders, dealing with customers, and maintaining the quality of the food was exhausting. Still, he couldn't help but notice one employee, a young woman named Emma, who worked with intensity. While the other workers took breaks and chatted, Emma stayed focused, always moving. Curious, David watched her from the corner of his eye as she darted around the deli. She seemed to never stop, always rushing between customers and kitchen tasks. She rarely smiled, but when she did, it was brief and distant. David couldn't figure out why she didn't take a break like the others. He observed her throughout the day, trying to pinpoint the source of her dedication. Something about her stood out, and he felt drawn to understand her story. David had already noticed Emma's work ethic, but he wasn't sure what drove her. He decided to approach her during the lunch rush when the line of customers was relatively short. Taking a deep breath, he casually leaned against the counter and asked, "Hey Emma, why don't you ever take a lunch break? You've been working nonstop all day." Emma paused for a moment, her hands frozen on the sandwich she was preparing. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and then she quickly returned to her work, her face tight. David could see she was avoiding the question, but he wasn't going to let it slide. "Come on, you've been here for hours. Everyone needs a break," he pressed gently. Emma sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. "I don't have time for lunch," she muttered, her voice low. "I just can't afford it." David's heart sank at her words, but before he could ask more, Emma turned away, lost in the busy flow of customers. He was left standing there, shocked, trying to comprehend what she had just said. David couldn't shake Emma's words from his mind. "I just can't afford it." Those words repeated over and over in his head, echoing through his thoughts as he worked alongside the other employees. He knew Emma was one of the hardest workers on the team, yet there was something deeper going on. He needed to understand more. The next day he kept his eyes on Emma, waiting for another chance to speak with her. As the lunch rush wound down, he found her wiping down tables and took a moment to approach her again. This time he tried to offer a different approach, speaking more softly. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. Is everything okay? Is there something I can help with?" Emma hesitated, glancing around nervously. "It's not something you can fix," she said quietly. "I don't make enough here to feed myself properly. I can barely pay my rent, and lunch is it's an extra cost I can't afford." She forced a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Don't worry about me. I'm fine." David was stunned. The reality that one of his employees couldn't even afford to eat lunch at his deli struck him like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on the business side of things, the profits and the numbers, that he had failed to notice the real struggles his employees faced. He began to see his deli in a new light. What kind of owner allowed their workers to go hungry? As he continued his shift, his thoughts were consumed by Emma's words. He tried to put himself in her shoes, imagining how difficult it must be to come to work every day, doing hard labor while barely making ends meet. David knew he had to learn more about the other employees and what their lives were really like. Emma's story was just the beginning, and he was determined to find out what else was going wrong within his business. Over the next few days, David made a point to interact with more of his employees. He learned that Emma wasn't the only one struggling. Maria, a cook, mentioned she was working 2 jobs just to pay her bills, and Greg, a cashier, was trying to support his young daughter on his own. There were others too, each with their own financial burdens and stories of hardship. David began to realize that his employees were living paycheck to paycheck, unable to save for the future. They worked long hours, and while they showed up every day and put in their best effort, they were barely scraping by. The pressure of their personal struggles weighed heavily on them, and David could see how it affected their energy, their moods, and their work. The atmosphere in the deli had changed for him. It wasn't just a place of business, it was a reflection of the lives of the people who worked there. The more David learned about his employees' hardships, the more he began to feel the weight of responsibility as their employer. He had always seen the deli as a business, a place to make money and provide a service. But now it felt like so much more. These were people's lives, their livelihoods, and he was in a position to make things better, or worse. David reflected on his role as the CEO of the deli. How could he have been so blind to the struggles his employees faced? How many times had he walked past them, completely unaware of their daily challenges? The guilt began to gnaw at him. He couldn't continue running the deli without acknowledging the needs of the people who made it work. They were the backbone of the business, and it was time he started acting like their leader, not just their boss. It was during a quiet evening shift that David had his emotional breakthrough. He was working alongside Emma again, this time in silence. The usual noise of the deli seemed distant, and David could see the exhaustion in Emma's eyes as she prepared a sandwich. He knew it had to be more than just hunger that kept her from eating. "Emma," he said softly, "you've been working so hard, and I know you're not getting the recognition you deserve." Emma didn't respond, but David could tell she was listening. "I want to change things. I want to make sure you're not struggling anymore." Emma turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "It's not that simple," she whispered. "You can't fix what's broken here." David looked into her eyes, and in that moment he realized how much more was at stake. He had to fix it. For Emma, for all of them. He couldn't keep turning a blind eye. He needed to make things right. Determined to help his employees, David began devising a plan to make real changes within the deli. He started by speaking with his managers and reviewing their pay rates, benefits, and work hours. He knew he needed to offer better wages, ensure employees were taking breaks, and provide support for their personal struggles. David also made a point to create a more open line of communication between the staff and management. He wanted to ensure his employees felt heard and respected. For the first time, he began thinking of ways to foster a work environment that was not only efficient but also supportive. He had already seen the effects of financial strain on his employees, and he was committed to relieving as much of that pressure as he could. After a week of planning, David called a meeting with his employees. He wanted to be transparent with them about what he had learned and how he planned to make changes. When everyone gathered in the staff room, David felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was his chance to show them he cared. "Look, I've been working alongside you all for the past week, and I've seen how hard you work," David began. "I've heard your stories, and I understand now that there are things we need to fix. I can't change everything overnight, but I'm committed to improving things here, starting with better pay, more breaks, and ensuring that no one goes without lunch." There was a long silence before Emma spoke. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice shaky. David nodded. "I do. And I'm sorry for not noticing sooner." David's promise to make changes wasn't just about words, it was about action. He immediately began implementing raises across the board and adjusted schedules to ensure everyone had regular breaks. He also introduced a free lunch program for employees, making sure no one had to work through hunger again. The changes were small at first, but they had an immediate impact. Emma was the first to thank him, her voice full of emotion. "I never thought you'd do something like this," she said quietly, her eyes bright with gratitude. David smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known he was missing. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. He wasn't just the owner of a business anymore, he was a leader who cared. As the weeks passed, David continued to observe the changes within the deli. The employees were more energized, happier, and felt appreciated. The atmosphere in the workplace had shifted. There was a sense of camaraderie and teamwork that hadn't existed before. Even the customers noticed the difference. David made a point to visit the deli every day, sometimes working alongside his employees, sometimes just chatting with them. He had made a commitment to himself to never lose touch with the people who made his business thrive. And as he watched Emma smile for the first time in what felt like forever, he knew he had made the right choice. One evening, as the deli was closing for the night, David sat alone in the back, reflecting on the journey he had been on. His decision to go undercover had been the catalyst for change, but it had also been an eye-opener in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had learned more about his employees in a few weeks than he had in the years he had owned the deli. He thought back to the moment Emma had shared her struggles with him. That one conversation had ignited a fire in him to make a difference. And now, as he looked around at the thriving deli and happy employees, he knew he had done just that. David smiled to himself. "This is just the beginning," he whispered. David realized that the true success of his business didn't lie in the profits or the number of customers served. It was in the lives he could improve. He began sharing his story with other business owners, advocating for better treatment and fair pay for employees in all industries. The changes he had made in his own deli were only the first steps in a much larger movement. David had discovered a new vision for his life and his business, one that prioritized people over profits and saw employees as partners rather than just workers. It was a vision that, David hoped, would ripple outward, changing the way businesses treated their staff and ensuring that no one ever felt invisible or forgotten again. Months later, the deli had become a model for other small businesses, showcasing what could happen when workers were valued and respected. Emma had blossomed into a confident leader in the kitchen, and many of the other employees had also thrived. David's decision to step into the shoes of a regular worker had not only changed his life but the lives of those around him. As he stood in front of the deli one last time, watching customers and employees interact with ease, David knew the true measure of success wasn't in profits. It was in the impact he had on the lives of his employees. And that, he realized, was worth more than any paycheck. The future of the deli was brighter than ever, and so was David's commitment to making sure everyone who walked through its doors, whether as a customer or an employee, felt seen, heard, and valued.